It is your destiny! But how do I know it's my destiny? Because I said so! But what do you mean you said so? How do you know that that's my destiny and not somebody else's, perhaps? Because I'm a talking skull, you moron! Hello, and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great Player, where we look at the question, how to deal with character destiny. Sometimes your destiny arrives in the form of a talking skull. Sometimes not so much. Sometimes your destiny is predetermined by you, the player, and it is not embraced by the GM. Sometimes it's created by the GM, and it's not embraced by you as the player. So let's just unpack this idea of character destiny. Character destiny is ultimately the idea that your character has some kind of ultimate goal that they need to achieve. Now, this goal is not something that will be achieved in one or two adventures. It is something that will be achieved over a course of, say, a year's worth of actual playing. Meeting on a regular basis once a week or once a month or twice a week or however often you play, and over a course of a year and a myriad of adventures, your character will eventually get to the point where they achieve their destiny. Now, as an example of just what is destiny, if you look, for example, at the Star Wars films, which are becoming much more topical now that Disney's taken over and they're going to release a movie every year, that's a lot of destinies that we're going to be seeing. But if we look at Luke Skywalker's destiny, from a role-playing perspective, his character was created as a farmhand who has some latent Jedi powers, but hasn't yet explored them because he's only level 1. He's on a farm, so he knows how to tinker with vaporators and with mechanical devices. He can fly a small little skivvy type of plane, and he's got some blaster experience. Other than that, he's a fairly ordinary character. He's actually a bit of a whiny brat. He wants to go off and join the Imperial Academy so he can become an Imperial pilot and fly for the Empire. His destiny is to slay his father, to a degree, on the Death Star and cause his father to turn from the dark side and kill the Emperor and thus install Luke as the new Jedi Master, and that is really the extent of his destiny. There's some stuff in between, but ultimately he should be facing against his father and defeating his father, whether physically or emotionally or spiritually, as in the case of the film. If we were looking at it from a role-playing perspective, do you think the GM had worked out, this little farmhand who comes from this desert planet is ultimately going to take on the right hand of the Emperor, and actually take on the Emperor himself, and cut off the right hand of the Emperor's right hand to become the Emperor's left hand, unless the Emperor is destroyed by the right hand who no longer has a... You get my point. Who came up with that idea? Okay, of course, in the case of the film, the author, Lord George Lucas, came up with that idea. But the principle is still applicable to you as the player. You create a character and you decide, wouldn't it be interesting if this particular character had as his ultimate destiny to become king of the realm? The details of how the character is going to get there shouldn't really be up to you. That should sit squarely with your GM. So when trying to work out your character destiny, and you've gone through the steps of creating your character and looking at your character's history, your destiny should be something that is almost completely opposite to where the character currently is. If we look at Luke Skywalker, he was a complete unknown on a desert planet. By the end of the third movie, he is leading the rebellion against the Dark Emperor himself at the very center of galactic conflict. In other words, he moved from complete obscurity to complete fame or infamy from the Empire's perspective, and moved from having no consequence in the universe to having almost all the consequence in the universe. If he had failed in his task, Leia would have been turned to the dark side and the Empire would have won. So from obscurity to absolute pinnacle of story conclusion. That's bold and that's grand. How did he get there? You look at his journey. He randomly bumps into this old master because of his droids running away. The old master manages to keep him away from his family, who get burnt to death by stormtroopers in a very uncharacteristic action on behalf of the stormtroopers. We'll ignore that plot hole. Anyway, we move on. And then he's suddenly in Mos Eisley, where he meets up with this bounty hunter who puts him on a starship, and then they go and rescue a princess who turns out to be his sister, and the story goes on and on and on. It's fairly epic in terms of how he eventually gets to where he gets to, and he gives up almost twice throughout the course of the films, but ultimately he ends up achieving his destiny. How do you apply that now to your character? You've decided you want your character to become the king of the land, and that's as far as you go. You then sit down with your GM and you say, GM, I don't know if you've got any major plans for my character's destiny, but if my character's destiny could be that he becomes king of the land, I would be particularly happy. How he becomes the king of the land is up to you, unless you want me to help work out certain key points. Most GMs will stand back and say, no, he will become king of the land. I will now work out how that's going to happen and slowly start to introduce it. So, as a good example, in the one game that I'm running online with the Patreons that support this channel, the one Patreon is seeking out his father, who has become a lycanthrope, or at least certainly that's what he believes his father to be. His destiny could arguably be to find his father and either confront his father and slay him, or tame the wild beast that is within his father and convert him back to being a regular human. That's as far as the player has gone. As the game master, I will now be putting everything in his path to A, keep him from his father, B, I will make sure that he falls in love with his father for the father's nobility, then I will make sure that he hates his father for some cruel betrayal that he perceives that his father has done against him, and then ultimately I will bring them together in some kind of massive conclusion at the end of the story. Actually, I won't. I'll do that just halfway into the campaign, because ultimately, as the game master, I want his story's resolution, his destiny, to be that he becomes a lycanthrope himself after having defeated his father, and he needs to realize that his character's goal of overcoming this beast-like creature is not actually the father, but it is the thing within him himself, his own internal lycanthrope, if you like. And that could possibly be an outcome. I do hope that he doesn't watch these videos. And if he does, I'm going to change it all again anyway, because that's the fun that a game master has with a player who has a destiny, or at least the idea of a destiny. So how then do you work with your destiny? You've told your GM, I want my character to become queen of all of the goblins. And your character starts an adventure that has nothing to do with goblins. Do you panic? Do you need to run around saying, GM, remember I'm supposed to be queen of the goblins soon, so we should probably be facing goblins instead of orcs, because this has nothing to do with my destiny. Don't worry about it. Your GM has got it well in hand. And now, if you think that your GM is starting to forget about your backstory, there's nothing wrong with, after the session, sitting down and saying, I really enjoyed today's session. Never hurts to butter at the GM. I'm just wondering, you haven't forgotten about my ultimate destiny, have you? I mean, I don't want to impose it on you, and if you have other plans, that's absolutely fine, but just remember we discussed this. Sometimes GMs are old and they forget things. On the other hand, most of the time the GM should say, oh, yeah, no, I haven't forgotten, don't you worry. And then you just go with the flow. Can you try and force your character destiny? Well, now, this is the fine line between metagaming and character play. Character play would dictate that if your character, who grew up on a farm and has had goblins raiding his farm forever, and your destiny is to become queen of the goblins, there's some things that are going to have to change in the story, but anyway, we'll go with the example for now, and he comes across some goblins. His reaction from a character perspective would be to slay the goblins. They have been a pest forever, and he simply wants them destroyed. As a metagame, and this is something that we will explore in another video, the difference between metagaming and role-playing, as a metagame you might be sitting in the back of your head, but I do want this character to become queen of the goblins one day. So let me try and look for an angle that fits with my character who hates goblins, fits with my narrative that ultimately the character will become the queen of the goblins, and try and find somewhere in between. Now, this doesn't mean that halfway through the session you ask the GM for a pause break so you can go and figure out your master plan. It should come naturally to you, or at least you should spend a few seconds going, well, a middle ground might be that perhaps the character decides instead of slaying all of the goblins, he's going to capture them and force them to take him to their leader. Now, that's a very small step on the journey of him becoming Queen of the Goblins, but it is a step in the right direction. It also shows that the character can grow from just killing goblins to now taking them prisoner and thinking outside of their usual parameter, because that's what has to happen. Players underestimate the fact that their characters and the player playing the character sometimes needs to have a shift. In most narratives, it's called the turning point, the first turning point in a film sequence. You have an introduction to the character, you have an introduction to the character situation, and then you have what is called the first turning point. And that turning point is where the character, for reasons of pressure, social reasoning, some kind of love magnet, some kind of reason, makes a decision that changes their life forever. So by having a character destiny to work towards, and having a character that's got a good backstory and that has a well-developed type, and you know what that character's about, when you see the GM possibly giving you a clue about your destiny, you can have this turning point where the character decides, I'm not going to kill them all, I am in actual fact going to imprison them and then demand that they take me to their leader so that I can learn more about these goblins. Why are they raiding this particular farm? What's motivating them? What's driving them? Because ultimately that could start to lead you on your journey to becoming Queen of the Goblins ultimately. Through discussing with the chief, the goblin chief, that it's actually ogres who are pressuring them further down the mountains, the character starts to realize that goblins are not necessarily as simple as at first they seem. Of course, the character will be betrayed by the goblins and handed over to the ogres later on in the campaign because, well, narratively speaking, that's what needs to happen. And then the character needs to be saved by the goblins later, and then needs to save the goblins later, preferably in some kind of decision where it's goblins or humans, and the humans are in the wrong, the goblins on the right, and the character must choose between their own people and the goblins. And that moment is another turning point, which again we have in the film industry. It is the second turning point where the character draws on their inner strength and makes the right decision, rather than the emotional decision, if you like. So by having a destiny, you're now adding on a layer to your character that is going to not have an immediate effect on your character, but will have long-term repercussions. And again, this is why once you've created your character and you've started playing, you should go back to your character notes, back to your character history, back to your character destiny, and decide, yes, this is working for me. Oh, I should have handled that situation slightly differently. Let me think next time before I just make an action. Let me think about how this is going to affect my character destiny as well as my character. Often it will feel as a player that your character is in the now and that you have to respond to what is happening now without any foreshadowing, without any future knowledge. Well, this is a game and it's a storytelling game. So you as the author of your character, you are the creator, the controller, and the guide for your character and their actions. By knowing what potentially could happen in the future, you need to temper your actions slightly. Very few authors will tell you that they just started writing a character and they just sort of let the character do whatever they want with no kind of end goal whatsoever. One of the rules in script writing is that you write your beginning, your middle, your end, and then you go back and rewrite your beginning, because it's not going to fit with your end. The point is about fitting the beginning to the end. So here you are at the beginning. You are in the beginning, if you like. If you know what the end could be, you can start to guide it and have fun by going, well, I think this is what the DM is giving me, so let me try and look at how my character can reinterpret the information and change. Not I've gone blank. Not irrationally, not illogically, not just suddenly today I love goblins, yesterday I hated them, but today I woke up and felt differently. It's about working out steps. It's about planning out your journey. And I know that this sounds like a lot of hard work and it seems as if you're almost writing a book rather than playing a game. But if you do put in a little bit of extra effort just before the session and go, yeah, my character is supposed to be working towards this point. Let me be aware of that while I'm playing in this session. And so that when my character's making a decision, I can almost step back just for a moment and go, does that lead me towards my end goal or does it move me away from it? It can move you away from it, especially if it's narratively interesting. On the other hand, moving you towards it is also interesting because then your GM has so much more to play with, because here's a player whose character is responding to the situation and is helping tell the story rather than just following the story. Well, I hope this has been useful on how to use Character Destiny to help improve and add an extra layer to your character that you are now creating and crafting and ultimately running. If it did, hit that like button. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. Join us on www.greatgamemaster.com if you want to add comments or leave thoughts on future videos that I can talk about. And of course, you can join us on Patreon and become a player in the Game That I Run via Skype every second Wednesday in the evening. I have two wonderful players who've got wonderful destinies and are encountering some interesting obstacles to discovering those ultimate destinies. We have a lot of fun. And until next time, I wish you and your character the very happiest of playing.